Welcome to all our viewers. Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to people who have joined us, our brothers and sisters across the diaspora and on the continent. This evening, we are in the second session of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. And just to bring everybody in the picture, every year for the last maybe 28 years, we have been hosting the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. The lecture series used to be called the Emancipation Lecture Series. After the passing of our dear brother Kwame Ture, we changed the name in his honor to the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. And that way we are able to keep his name alive and in the memory of all of us. We've had over the many years some very outstanding scholars and activists who have been able to join us as part of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. This year is no different. If you were here with us last week, you would have heard that wonderful young man, Dr. Peniel Joseph, speak about his work on Kwame Ture and his work on the issues of Black Power, his work on Dr. Martin Luther King and our brother Malcolm X. And today we continue the series. Today, we are looking at Africa on the international stage, challenges and successes. We continue next week, Thursday, at the same time and place. And I want to draw your attention to the other aspects of the program. You will see that today we have with us Professor James Small. We have our sister Angela Nana Afoli Odai, who is the acting head of the Diaspora Division, Citizens and Diaspora Division of the African Union. We'll talk more about her later. We also have with us young Mr. Joseph Aketema, who is a PhD candidate at the Institute of African Studies in Ghana, and he will also join us. So this evening, we expect a very rich discussion on Africa on the international stage, its challenges and successes. Then we move next week to Haiti, a Pan-African responsibility. And we will have with us there Professor Muriel Fanon Mendez France and our own Brother Raul Gibbons. On the 13th of July, we will be looking at youth in crisis, the responsibility of education, educators, and elders. And there we have an outstanding sociologist, Dr. Pedro Noguera, who will be talking about youth in crisis. We have our own young Khadija Daya from the Emancipation Support Committee, and that program will be moderated by Shabaka Kambon. Then on the 20th, we round off the series with women in the Pan-African struggle. We start with our powerful sister, Dr. Carol Boyce Davies, who is Professor Emerita at Cornell University in the Africana Studies Department, and our own Dr. Olubisi Kuboni, retired senior lecturer at the University of the West Indies, and Dr. Keisha Thompson. So we're going to have a very rich Kwame Ture Memorial Series. Put it on your agenda, tell your friends and your neighbors, word of mouth works, share the information around on your social media platforms, and enjoy. So having said that, let me introduce our very first speaker for this evening. He's none other than Professor James Small, scholar and activist. Professor Small might be no stranger to most of you. Dynamic speaker, organizational consultant. He is also the CEO of the Sana Lodge Enterprise in Ghana Limited and CEO and president of the African American Management Company of Ghana. He has been the international vice president of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, the OAAU. He is a priest of the Oya and Babalo Risha of the Ifa tradition, and past president of the Eastern region of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization. Professor James Small is a former Black Studies lecturer at the Black Studies Department of the City College of New York. He is a wonderful friend of the Emancipation Support Committee, having come to Trinidad and Tobago and speak at the Kwame Ture Lecture Series in the past. We just love having him on this particular topic, Africa on the international stage, the challenges and successes. And we begin with Professor James Small. Brother Small, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sister Asha, and thank you, the Emancipation Support Committee, and thank those who make up the Kwame Ture lecture series. You know, Kwame and I were friends since age 21. We engaged in a lot of struggle together through the years. I miss his spirit all the time, all the time. But this is a nice question today, and you know, looking at Africa on the international stage. A lot of people would like to think we're not on that stage. And you must also excuse my voice a little today. It's this smoke stuff we're dealing with from Canada's fire right now has been horrific on the voice. But I'd like to read a statement by the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who described Africa as a scar on the conscience of the world. Here's a man who comes from the nation that survived as a nation, that grew as a nation, that thrived as a nation from the stolen, abundant wealth of Africa, and still carrying on its neo-colonial economic stranglehold over Africa with its Western partners, would dare to make such a statement about Africa being a scar on the world. But I think they're all a bit surprised. They're always surprised that when they put Africa down, Africa just seems to rise up even higher. And I want to read another statement, and then I'll get into kind of my message. This is from the Brookings Institute. Now, the Brookings Institute is no real friend of African truism, because we know it represents most of the intelligence gathering network of the Western community, especially the United States of America, and trying to get the kind of information they need to keep Africa from developing. But what they had to say is a bit telling, because sometimes you have to tell yourself the truth in order to do whatever it is you have to do, whether it's good or bad. And so in a statement, this is a statement that goes back to 2020. And it said, the new year 2020 marks the beginning of a promising decade for Africa. Through at least the first half of the decade, economic growth across Africa will continue to outperform that of other regions, with the continent continuing to be home to 7 of the world's fastest growing economies. Collectively, among African and global policymakers, to improve the livelihood of all under the blueprint of Sustainable Development Goals and the African Union's Agenda 2063, is representative of the shared energy and excitement around Africa's potential. So they agree that Africa is extraordinary in its development process. They agree that Africa is leading the world in many areas of development, especially much of that world which we don't call Western. Africa has instituted new educational initiatives, especially universal secondary education development in many of the countries. I think Africa is clear that we have the fastest growing youth population in the world, and probably the largest youth population under 30 years old in the world. And so education, and especially technical education, is essential if we are to create or move into what they're calling the 4th industrial revolution. And remember that term, because we need to understand what they're meaning by the 4th industrial revolution, because Africa is going to have to develop its own indigenous technocracy to challenge this new 4th industrial revolution. And let me just lay something that I always put out at the foundation of any discussion by any people must be the discussion of economics, politics, culture, and their sacred science system. I would use sacred science system in place of spiritual system and in place of religion. I think Africa have a sacred science system that is one of the best in the world when understood and practiced. And I think we need to make it more universal and minimize the religious and spiritual systems of others to the degree that they influence our psycho-spiritual understanding of how we design our worldview. And this is about developing worldviews based on the information that's available to you. And so one of the questions I ask myself for today, when we talk about Africa, what is Africa? You know, Africa is not a nation state. It's not a country. It is a continent. And it is a continent that has 55 nations. And these 55 nations are all sovereign nations, meaning they have their own government, their own political system, their own economic system to a great degree, though there's some integration taking place at many levels in Africa now, which is very beautiful, that we created the free trade zone, and about 50% of the nations have, have validated the free trade zone, and another 30% have agreed to it, but it has not been validated yet. And the few that's on the periphery, we hope that they come in. We know that the ECOWAS development, the Economic Community of West Africa has proven to be a very positive body in developing the economic center of those nations in Western Africa. And we know that the Eastern African Union have done an extraordinary job. And even in the southern sector, though they have moved very turbulently, the affair in Congo and the affair in Zimbabwe, which is not Zimbabwe made nor Congo made, they both precipitated, agitated, and furthered by Western governments, and particularly America and Britain and France. And so we need to pay some real serious attention when people make the criticism of Zimbabwe and the criticism of Congo, when Western corporations are dominating the government and the rogue paramilitary units that they've armed and put in these countries to try and overthrow the legitimate will of the people of these countries. So Africa has to be seen as a continent, not a nation. And it is hard to talk about Africa in terms of even the question we've asked, because Africa is not on the stage yet. 55 African nations is on the world stage. And they do have a body that they're trying to work out of. And that body is called the African Union, which is the successor to the Organization of African Unity, founded by Kwame Nkrumah and others. And so we watch the African Union as it's trying very hard to promote unity and solidarity between the 55 states, as it's trying very hard to eradicate colonialism, because colonialism in all of its form is still in Africa. Neo-colonialism, meaning the control of our educational system, our intellectual enterprise, and our economy, is still pretty much in the hands of the West. And then we have the Chinese coming in through the back door. They're making better contracts and we're getting some better deals, but let's not fool ourselves. They're there for the purpose that others are there for, and that is the raw materials of Africa. And then we have to deal, when we talk about Africa, we have to deal with the International Monetary Fund. We need to know what it is. We have to deal with the World Bank, and we need to understand what it is, what they say of themselves, and both is located in Washington, D.C. And the World Bank was founded by America in 1944, and America holds the veto power over any policy decisions in the World Bank organization, which they say is owned by member states, 188, I think, member states, including many of our nations from Africa. Yet one nation has the right to veto anything they disagree with. So that means it's not a democratic body at all. It is an American economic dictatorship to control the economic development, particularly and especially of Africa. But this is handled through the information that the International Monetary Fund, in its job, monitoring other monetary systems around the world, and then being able to identify what they call risk, but at the same time determining who can get loans and who can't, and what the interest on those loans are going to be. And we have no control over these bodies. And yet they're controlling the economic development of our countries. And to show you the ridiculousness of some of this, when we look at Africa has 30% of the world mineral resources. They say 30, I would say it's about 50. We have 8% of the natural gas, 12% of the oil, 40% of the gold, 28% of iron ore, 90% of chromium, 90% of platinum, 70% of coltan, 60% of cobalt. I haven't even touched the diamond yet. With that kind of wealth, there should be no poverty anywhere on the continent of Africa. But because of the two organizations I've mentioned, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and their relationship to the former colonial states and America as the financier and investor into those colonial states, Africa is still in trouble economically and technocratically because the West does everything in its power not to share its technology with Africa. In this hemisphere that we live in, given the numbers, the sheer numbers of Africans living in the Western Hemisphere, we should ask the question then, why is America outsourcing its technology to Pakistan, to India, to Thailand, to Korea, when it has this massive African population living amongst it, but it does not outsource its technology and the education that goes with that technology development to African nations? What is that about? Why do we have to wait for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to make the decision on the value of the CD in Ghana, which is now, I think, 11 to 1 American dollar, which is ridiculous and insulting. And anybody that we are connected with that would make that kind of assignment, given the wealth in Ghana from its bauxites, from its what do we call it? The manganese, from its gold, from its diamond. How in the world can our currency be devalued to such a degree by an international body where we have no control? And we're forced to go along with that devaluation that determines our qualification for loans or any kind of assistance from international bodies and banks. And therein lies one of the major problems on the continent of Africa. We see it in America. It's called debt slavery, where you have all these young people graduating from college and they give them these loans and they put such an exorbitant interest rate on them that the young people will never be able to make it to the middle class or challenge the American upper class, no matter how many degrees they have, because they're indebted for most of their lives. Well, that same process is what is used in Africa to indebt our nation, despite the wealth that we have. I think last year, the Western world gave in what they call aid to Africa, $7.6 billion in one form or another. But at the same time, they took out of Africa $195 billion, right? And natural resources illicitly. I'm not talking about the ones that the resources they said, oh, we have legitimate deals and legitimate contracts for, because that comes to about another $170 billion. So we're talking about $300 billion worth of aid we're giving to the West, and they're giving us $7 billion and saying we're the recipient of the aid. And so we have to really look at this thing. But with all of this, Africa is making extraordinary strides in the area of medicine, in the area of upgrading the technologies, institutions in the nation. I'm most familiar with Ghana. I love what has happened at the University of Cape Coast with this new medical school. and the new innovations and the ability to deliver high-tech medical service to a larger percentage of the community. And Cape Coast would not be considered one of the major cities. It's not Accra. It is not Kumasi. It's not Tamale. And yet that kind of development is taking place. And we see that in a lot of places across the continent. We can go to Rwanda and just marvel at what the government of Rwanda has done. We can have our issues with Museveni in Uganda, but look at some of the sustainability goals that Uganda have met, and look at the eradication of poverty at many of the markers in Uganda. And if you look across the continent, our eradication of poverty has been extraordinary. And our ability to deliver better health services to more people have been extraordinary, despite the fact that our supposedly Western partners have had such difficulty with sharing medical technology with us. Imagine holding back medical technology, So I can see you don't want me to have the rocket technology and the aviation technology, but you don't want me to have basic medical technology and be talking about humanity. But despite those things, I used to tell my students, there was a Professor Small, you've been to Africa. Well, how did you get there? Because I flew on a jet plane that landed at an international airport, like all other planes. We didn't land in a cornfield. We landed at an international airport. We went through all the international protocols. I got me a taxi cab and I went to my hotel. And it is a wonderful internationally standard hotel, as it is anywhere else in the world. And so when we look at many of the African capitals, the development over the last 10 years have been extraordinary, both in the development of marketplaces and shopping centers, giving the working class more access to the kinds of goods and services that normally we didn't see 20, 30 years ago. And the other part that's beautiful about it, if you're looking at, there is one new shopping center in Ghana. The place is called Mallam Junction. It's one of the biggest in West Africa. I'd say about 50% of the vendors are African, are home people. Many times we see all the stores, all the international brands, they're there too. But the African vendors are there in large numbers in almost all of the shopping centers. And we're seeing the replication of those in other communities that's almost exclusively African local vendors that's able to modernize and replicate using social media and other technologies. But the education of the African youth, having more access to free education from K to 12, and having access to the university and able to get assistance, those are the key things in developing the continent of Africa. The second and most important, and then I'll slow down, is jobs. How do we employ this population of young people that we're educating? And that's going to be the real test for us. So this is where we come to looking at African indigenous industrial development. And we have to start by determining in the contract arrangements we are making with what happens to the raw material when it comes out of the ground. We know bauxite, for instance, which Ghana has a big supply of bauxite, and bauxite goes through 6 stages of development. And there was a company in Ghana, and I forgot the name, but they would receive the bauxite that was processed in the West at stage 3, and Ghana would finish the last 3 stages. Well, we can do that with any of the mineral resources. Instead of loading the barges that I see going on in many countries and sending our raw material away, we should make agreements where at least the first 50% of the stage of the transformation of their resources take place on the continent itself. Now, this goes with diamond, gold, bauxite, manganese, whatever the resources is. And we would create a revolution around employing our young people and bringing the technology to bear in those industries. We saw Magufuli do it in Tanzania before he unfortunately passed away. But what he did with just the gold and diamond industry, instead of allowing the raw material to be taken out of the ground by the British company that was the dominant company there, taken to Britain to be processed, he had a certain percentage of that process take place in Tanzania. And that's what Mugabe was trying to do and did successfully do in Zimbabwe. Then we're going to take it out of the ground. We're going to run the operation. We're going to be in charge. We're not going to sign a contract and hand it to you, and then you go into our land and take out God knows what. We don't even know how much you're taking out of the country, let alone how much you're paying us for what you're taking out of the country, or you say you're taking out of the country. Africa is the wealthiest place on the planet Earth. Africa has the largest youth population on the planet Earth. Africa has the largest potential. We were suffering because of the war in Ukraine, because the West had made Ukraine the wheat basket for the world, owned by different Western countries, America, Britain, and others. And Africa policies was put in place to keep Africa from developing its agricultural potential while it's importing rice. And it's ridiculous to think that Africa would import rice from China or any place else, or from America or any place else, or wheat from Ukraine to feed its people. And if it doesn't get these things, we are facing some hunger strike. When we have the land available to produce the food Africa needs and to supply the rest of the world if we wanted to. But yet we are restricted by the lack of technology, the lack of access to certain technology, and other political arrangements from developing the agro conglomerates that would make Africa the breadbasket for Africa and the rest of the world. So those things, and Africa is working on some of this, and I give the African Union credit. It has been trying very hard to create policy arrangements that make sense. And so that many of the borders, if not most on the continent now, one, we don't have to pay taxes on the goods as we are crossing the borders. One of the big things in Ghana at night is to see all the trucks lined up going to Cote d'Ivoire, or lined up going to Togo, or lined up going up to Tamale into the north, because, or on the other side coming in, because everybody had to go through the taxation process and to see what's coming in the country and what's going out of the country. Part of the security part of that, I understand. But to pay taxes to cross from one country to the other, which is like crossing the street, didn't make much sense for the economy of Africa. And they've struck down most of those tariffs, which is very good for the continent of Africa. And so I don't see much. We're thinking about the crises. The crisis is to make sure that we continue to develop our education, not allow for the best of our young people to have to leave Africa to get a higher education. The second thing is we have to be very strong about is how we pay our educators and how we pay our medical personnel and other people in essential services, because we are training them in Africa and we are losing them to the rest of the world. And we have to somehow turn that around. If we could turn that around by the way we deal with salaries for people in the educational sector, and especially in the medical sector, we will see a marked change in the health condition of our people across the continent. We're already seeing it in the educational sector, with so many of the governments now giving universal free education to their people. And so for me, I see nothing but promise in Africa. The West like to talk about corruption, but I live in America. There's no government as corrupt as my government, except our corrupt people get to run for office again with praise, and nobody goes to jail no matter how much you publicize their corruption. And most of the people that they've called corrupt in Africa, these were people you trained in your countries, that you put in place in our country, and you maintain in place in our country. And when things fell apart, you blame it on the victim that you put in to be a predator on their own people under your control. And I think that is stopping a lot because now the young people of Africa is getting more involved in local politics, more involved on the national stage in terms of holding their political leaders' foot to the fire. We're seeing more people in the rural areas. Even though we have a heavy march to the urban centers, we're seeing more development, local governmental development in the rural areas. African democracy is superior to any in the world, except we never call it a democracy. Sadly, that's our shortcomings. I love the local systems in most parts of Africa. I've been to about 30 countries, and I've watched the local system work extraordinarily well, and especially when they're in partnership with the new contemporary Western type of nation state systems. They still work very well at the local level in terms of justice for the local population and in terms of giving people access to resources. The basic problem with access to resources is the Western world not sharing their patents, not sharing the kinds of technology with us that they share with one another, even though they're getting more value for their dollar in the raw materials coming out of Africa than they're getting anywhere else in the world. And so Africa is on a path. I think the young people are clear. Social media has been extraordinarily helpful. They're talking about building the Africa they want to see. And that Africa is an extraordinary Africa. And we see it in place all over Africa now, from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the Central to the South. We see African young people returning from Europe, returning from North America, returning back home, returning from the Soviet Union, coming back home to develop the country with the technology and the degrees and skills they've gathered abroad. How do we marshal the kind of capital needed so that they will be able to build the businesses they need to build? That's going to be a challenge. But I think that's going to be a challenge Africa is going to be able to meet. So I think when I think of our topic, I think Africa on the global stage, we're performing better than most people ever thought we would. They thought that we would not be able to handle COVID. Africa handled it better than any other area in the world. And the world is still baffled about what happened there. Or maybe we were healthier in terms of how we eat. We are healthier in terms of our lifestyles for the most part. Yes, we're in crisis like every other people. When we get into urban setting and we start copying other cultures, we get in trouble. But for the most part, Africa came through this pandemic wonderfully when you consider what the world said would have happened to us. No one is saying, oh my God, it didn't happen. And why didn't it happen? Maybe Africa knows something and is doing something the rest of the world needs to learn from. You know, and that's something is we do have an indigenous medicine system, and we do use that medicine system. And when it's paired with contemporary modern medicine, it proves to be extraordinarily good. And so we need to think about that and how to develop that part of our medical system for the betterment of our people. Militarily, we know we're not in position to go up against the West toe to toe because of its military technology. But if we educate our people, no nation, no matter what their military technology is, will be able to defeat those nations. I'm proud of what occurred in Mali. People don't fully understand it yet, or what's been going on in Burkina Faso. You don't understand it yet, but I think our people are prepared to break the back of the Francophone hold on the economy of the so-called Francophone states in Western Africa. And I think those two countries have made a strong move towards that being done. There's a lot going on because there's a lot of forces against us. We've got the Soviets all over Africa. They've come with their proposals. We've got the Chinese. They've come with their proposals. The Arabs have come with their proposals. The East Indians have come with their proposals. And so have the Western nations of Britain, France, and the United States have come with their proposals. but nobody have a proposal to make sure that we are able to thrive and survive at the highest level when they're gone. So we have to make sure that our leadership understands, and I think most of our leadership does, that the people will determine the future of the country. And if the governmental structures don't appropriately partner with the people, they will keep going through the transition of despots until we do that properly. But I think we're on the way, because I think the young people of the continent are getting so much more involved in the politics and getting so much more involved in building the infrastructure of both levels of retail and wholesale business and the international business interrelationship between the diasporan Africans, both the new diasporan Africans and the old diasporan Africans and the Africans on the continent. And I think that's going to make a big difference in how rapidly we develop what they call this fourth industrial revolution. So I'm happy. I think Africa is on the path to the kind of freedom Kwame wanted. We may have to struggle around the ideological questions, but I think ideology will take a back seat if we really study African culture and study African sacred science system. We will find we have our ideology already in place. We need to study it, learn it, grow it, and expand on it. So that's my message on the question. And then I'll be prepared to answer any questions.
Thank you very, very much, Professor James Small. I think you've set the tone. You've given us a really heck of a lot to chew on. I like the idea of Africa as the promise. You've given us quite a broad overview. And I think this discussion on the youth and jobs, it's a critical area and very important. So I really think you've highlighted a number of issues that we've got to look at. And I look forward to where this discussion will go this afternoon. And now it's, before we get into questions, I know everybody's got a question they want to raise with our good brother Small there, but we just hang on to your questions, write them down, we will address them. But now we're going to hear from our sister, Miss Angela Na Afoli Odai. She is the acting head of the Diaspora Division, Citizens and Diaspora Division of CEDAW, and of the African Union Commission in Addis Ababa. Angela is a development expert with 13 years experience in diaspora engagement and migration and development at both national and continental levels. So we really do look forward, and we're very pleased because it's very, very late in the evening where Angela is, and she made that commitment and sacrifice to be able to join us so that we can have this rich discussion of African voices talking about Africa on the international stage, the challenges and successes. So the floor is now yours, Angela.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamal. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. First, before I begin my speech, I would love to actually acknowledge the immense contribution of the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago for a very good job done, and for the fact that we're here gathered today for the 2023 Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series, which has been a platform so far on which is dedicated to actually a legacy of a remarkable individual who has championed freedom, justice, and equality. It may also interest you to note that my father actually named me after Angela Davis. And so actually, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to you for extending this invitation to the African Union Commission and I. So today we have come here to actually discuss this issue on Africa and the international stage, Africa on the international stage, successes and challenges and successes. Actually, Professor Small, I thank you. He has done a lot. He's been very expansive, and he's done a lot of. He's brought out the issues on, especially the challenges, and then where we're going from here. So as not to sound a bit monotonous, I'll just delve straight into some of the things that the AU has been doing at the continental level to avert most of the challenges that he has mentioned already and that most of us here are aware of. So, jumping straight in, I will discuss issues of the fact that the continent has seen some significant growth in economics, so far as despite the fact that we had a lot of issues got to do with the COVID pandemic, whereby there was a lot of money into continental task forces, so on and so forth, and coupled as well with the Russian-Ukrainian war, with issues of weed and all that. But however, the continent has actually demonstrated this kind of resilience and has achieved some significant economic growth on the issues whereby we've seen that there have been expansion of various diversification of various investments, markets, and industries. And then the hype in telecommunications, agri, and manufacturing too has been enormous. This cannot be discussed without the inclusion of the diaspora, because we witness a lot of diaspora businesses, a lot of diaspora entrepreneurs coming in, putting together their quota, ensuring that either using through their networks, through their various skills, and then their financial and social contributions were able to actually bring in a kind of buffer to those on the continent and then speed things up, scale things up, things such as small, medium scale enterprises. It was made more, should I say, solidified or concrete. Otherwise, it would have gone downtrodden. Now, several African Union member states have actually embraced most of these market-oriented reforms and have attracted a lot of foreign investments as well. And then as well as these diversified markets that we see diasporas in every facet of it. So I would say as well that there's been an emergence of the middle class, which is also very positive so far as the continent is concerned, and then improved standards of living for many Africans. Now, African Union countries have made progress in regional integration initiatives, and I cannot, of course, mount this podium and not make mention of the AU-led African Continental Free Trade Area, which happens to be the world's largest free trade area that seeks to facilitate intra-African trade, enhance economic integration, and then foster development across the continent. And currently, over the past 2 years, the African Union has been urging its member states to loosen up most of their stringent borders, since products cannot move without people. And so there is a need for us to actually have certain reforms, such as the ratification of the Free Movement Protocol, so that we'll be able to enhance ease movement so far as the continent is concerned, and then so far for successful trading on the continent. With regards to issues of us being at the forefront or has been beriddled with a lot of conflicts, which have been persistent in some of our regions, we have witnessed a lot of successful building and conflict resolution efforts championed by the continental body, whereby regional organizations have been able to play a crucial roles in mediating conflict, promotion of peacekeeping missions, and then facilitating peace agreements. And among these, I would say that notable among them cut across from Liberia, Sierra Leone, Mozambique, lately Ethiopia. And then there was a news item of President Ruto of Kenya as well, making sure that he was calling for dialogue so far as Sudan is concerned in order to avert the scourge of a genocide. So these are some of the initiatives that have been led by the AU and have been led by Africans themselves to make sure that the continent is safe for us all, especially upholding issues of responsibility to protect the next person or the next nation state. On issues of technological advancement, I will say that Africa has speedily actually caught up with the pace. And as Professor mentioned earlier, social media is everywhere. And then COVID also had its upsides in a sense that we saw the birth of telemedicine, for example, between diasporas from Sierra Leonean diasporas and Sierra Leone, whereby they were able to engage with their compatriots on the continent. And then we saw a lot of Sudanese medical professionals also trying to tap in and ensuring that people were safe and then people were good. Not only did this start with COVID, but earlier we could see that during Ebola and so on and so forth. So there's been this widespread adoption of mobile technology, and then actually it has been able to revolutionize areas, sectors such as the finance sectors. In Kenya, again, you see the M-Pesa, you see with partnerships that the African Union has with the EU, for example. We are discussing a lot of digitization of various economies, digitize or mechanize agriculture, healthcare, as mentioned earlier, amongst others. There have been various innovative solutions so far as banking is concerned as well. And then we are reaching out particularly to rural areas, remote areas lately, in order for them to be able to transact cashless business to save that which they have. On the issue of culture, I would say that our rich cultural heritage and artistic expressions have gained recognition globally. And we are all well versed with African music everywhere. Of course, with the help of YouTube and Spotify, so on and so forth, we have a rich African literature, we have fashion, we have our cuisine, we have the visual arts, and then we have all these things have gained momentum in international circles, which are actually showcasing the continent's diversity and creativity. A special example, a very evident one, is during the Dubai Expo as well. There was the African Union stand, and there were a lot of African Union member states who were portraying that which they have, cutting down from their natural resources to the various innovations that they have done that we could identify with, or they could be identified with, as a unique blend of people. Then on issues of peacekeeping and diplomacy, we can all note as well that we have the African continent has actually contributed its troops and then a lot of its efforts in peacekeeping efforts globally. So you see African peacekeepers who are in Lebanon, amidst all other places. They have ventured into every aspect of the globe, making sure that we make the world more integrated and more safe than it is. So the African Union and regional organizations have as well deployed a lot of peacekeeping missions. Most of them have been African-led as well, to countries such as Somalia, Sudan, and Mali. So this demonstrates the continent's commitment to promoting peace and security, both within and then beyond their continent. And recent developments, we can all testify to Ethiopia's 2-year war, recent war, and the African-led peace process in Ethiopia. This reminds us of the immense potential that the continent holds and our ability to actually address challenges and resilience, and with the resilience and the kind of determination that it deserves. However, it is crucial for us to delve deeper into the multifaceted dynamics surrounding Africa's presence on the international stage. With our rich history, the vast resources, as mentioned earlier, and recently our ability to be very assertive on issues such as during the economic issues recently in Paris, during the economic forum or summit, whereby we saw heads of state of Africa questioning issues got to do with the Bretton Woods results or outcomes. And I still would not actually repeat Professor Small, but then questioning the fact that these institutions are in favor of the West more to the detriment of Africa. And these are some of the discourses that we are calling to bear. And it is my hope that it will yield the kind of response that we need the world to yield, the world to actually concentrate on, so that we discuss issues of fairness, issues of equity, and then issues of moving on and progress Africa's progression, so as not to be seen in the light of poverty, an impoverished continent, so on and so forth. But then we could leverage that and then change that kind of discourse into something more positive going forward. One of the primary challenges Africa faces is this persistent legacy of colonialism. The scars left by centuries of exploitation, oppression, injustice continue to actually haunt the continent's developmental trajectory. Lately, in this February 2023's African Union Summit, Ghana as a member state led for and then proposed the championing of a reparative justice mechanism which could be moved on going forward, not only with the outlook of looking at the African continent, but with the trajectory of ensuring that there's South-South cooperation in view of this initiative. To this end, we are looking at, in the last quarter of 2023, we're going to start, the AU led by Ghana is going to start the Reparative Justice Conference, which is tentatively in October, at the end of October, being hosted by Ghana for 3 days. And then we're going to start the discourse. Within that also has the committee of experts that are yet to be put together to be able to run a more consistent and then a more sustainable reparative justice advocacy, and then ensure that the due, Africa's due, is granted amicably. So now, on issues of Africa's international presence again, we'll realize that our diaspora are the biggest and then the most diverse. Lately, we received another correspondence from one of our diaspora setups on the cities who are African diasporas who are based in, who live in India. So we have well over 200 million African diasporas in the Americas, and then we have others. We have various strata of diasporas as well, and all these people who identify with the continent, who are of African descent, and really are willing to engage the continent, are a veritable resource that we have, that the continent can actually leverage. So based on these, we could realize that we have come a long way as a continent It's not been smooth, it's been procedural, but then again, there's light at the end of the tunnel once we start looking at issues of how do we leverage our youth? How do we make sure we enhance cross-border trade? How do we ensure too that our women are at the table so that we cut off, we are able to, over a period of time, yes, we've done well over time, but as time goes on, we are able to actually have women, women at the table, even in our rural setups, for them to be able to actually be able to decide for themselves, and then ensure that society grows and is well groomed, not only financially, but then with the content and with the character of the kind of people that our societies actually groom to handle our generations in the future. With this, I would lightly make mention of the diaspora legacy projects that the AU has been championing till date. We have the African Institute of Remittances, which looks established in 2013, and it's based in Nairobi, Kenya, to see to it that remittances on the continent are reduced substantially so that by 3%, so that with 3%, we are able to actually engage, we are able to actually have diasporas remitting more and more. And then we have the African Diaspora Investment Fund, which is targeting diaspora savings, looking at how best we can actually invest and at the same time contribute in the form of an endowment fund towards various developmental projects on the continent. Then we are looking at a professional skills database, a diaspora professional skills database that will harness the human capital of our diaspora so that wherever we have the gaps or the lapses in our professional setup or in our society, they are able to fit in, whilst at the same time encouraging member states to as well ensure that their governance structures are well built so as to avoid brain wastage, because we realize lately that a lot of youth have graduated from various institutions, and there's either a mismatch between that which they learned in tertiary institutions and that which the labor market wants, or they are not able actually to acquire the kind of professions, or those professions are not available given us the kind of relatively small economies that we have on the continent. So these are some of the things that we engage member states with, and then we are encouraging viable labor exports as well, so that at the end of the day, we will not only sing the sorrows of brain drain, but then we would see the reality and be very objective about most of the neoclassical push factor that actually contributes to the exodus of most of our youth, which ends up becoming brain waste in most of the instances. We are now looking at we are now looking at an African volunteer corps, youth volunteer corps, and then again we are seeing how best to harness our diaspora to experience both worlds, for them to be able to compete as well with their Western counterparts in both the developing world and then the developed world, for them to have actually a balance so far as work ethics and then work experience is concerned. With all these, the African Union's Agenda 2063 is looking towards actually forming an integrated high-speed train network, which would actually link to all African cities, the formulation of an African commodities strategy as well. We are looking at the Continental Free Trade Area, which has actually since 2018 been established. We are looking at an African passport on the free movement of people, which will actually ease the kind of blockades that we have with immigration within the continent. We discussed issues of, we are actually aspiring and we are looking at flagship projects such as the silencing of the guns. And then we are seeing about the implementation of the Grand Inga Dam project. We are looking at the establishment of a single African air transport market, whereby if Angela is to be moving from Ethiopia or Addis Ababa to Marrakesh, it would not take her 27 hours anymore, but there will be a more friendly route, because you would realize that from Accra to Marrakesh, for example, may take you 5 hours, but then from Addis Ababa instead to Marrakesh would take you more. So that some of these issues would actually be assessed. You will realize as well that people can come in, others can travel in from Europe, and they have shorter flights than those within the continent. And all these things are items or issues that the AU is championing, engaging member states on, urging member states to enable them see the essence of true African integration, if that is what we really want to see. The establishment of an annual African Economic Forum to boost the kind of economies that we have, and then the establishment of an African financial institutions, the Pan-African e-network, the Encyclopedia Africana project that seeks to actually reflect all facets, and then all innovations of Africans, true authentic African history will be reflected in there, as well as Africa Outer Space Strategy, and then the African Virtual and E-University, amongst cybersecurity, the Great African Museum, amongst others. So basically, this is what the AU is looking at so far, and we are engaging the diaspora as much as we can to ensure that we are able to grant them the kind of sense of belongingness that they need, mobilize and then engage, promote the interests of their all our mutual interests on Pan-Africanism, to see to it that at the end of the day, we are able to actually chart a path that will lead to our mutual benefits. So in acknowledging the continent's journey on the international stage, we all know it is not without complexities. Addressing these systematic challenges, such as poverty, inequalities, inadequate infrastructure, requires concerted efforts from African governments, international organizations, the diaspora, and then all global stakeholders, so that with mutual respect and shared responsibility, these will be essential to actually foster sustainable development in realizing Africa's potential. As we are gathered here today, I would kindly urge us all to reflect on the lessons of draw inspiration from recent successes, and then chart a path forward so that Africa's story, which is one of resilience and then vibrancy and untapped potential, we would be able to actually forge forward towards the Africa that we want. I thank you all, and may this Kwame Chure Memorial Lecture Series inspire us all to work towards a more inclusive and a just world.
We thank you very, very much, Angela. And don't go away. I know it's late on your side of the world, but I'm sure your presentation has generated a lot of interest, and I'm sure people will be asking questions. So if you can spare us a little more time, we'd love to be able to get some be allowed to ask you some questions and get you to engage with some of the participants from around the globe, who I'm sure are very happy to hear from you, and will have more questions. Now we're going to move on, and I myself have some very questions to ask, but we're going right along with this panel discussion before we open to questions. So we now have a young man from the University of Ghana, Legon. He is Mr. Joseph Aketema. He's already completed his MA and MPhil. He's a PhD candidate in using media and culture at the Institute of African Studies. So we're very, very pleased to have the voices of young people sharing with us in this discussion on Africa on the international stage, its challenges and successes. So I give you Mr. Joseph Aketema. Joseph, the floor is yours.
Very good evening, and I say good evening because I know certain portions of the world may be evening. And first of all, I want to thank the organizers of this program and the African diaspora for touching base. When I say touching base, getting to the likes of us to contribute. First of all, permit me to state that in Africa or Ghana, we say an ancestor is not dead unless forgotten. And so today we are reminded that Kwame Ture lives on, and so is Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, same as Reverend Abenate, same as Marcus Mosiah Garvey, same as Sylvester Henry Williams. I may also want to add that Kwame Ture, in his own words, will say that if you struggle for justice, you can never lose, even if they kill you. And that resonates strongly with the Afrocentric notion of an ancestor is not dead unless forgotten. It is very, very much important for us to understand who our ancestors are. They are not collaborators with our enemies. They are not people who sold our souls, our resources to benefit those who continue to exploit us. So today, if we celebrate Kwame Ture in this important lecture or discussion, it is important to recognize that he has become an ancestor who has left very, very heavy footprints that are so indelible, and to the end of time, they can never actually be erased. And so he, in his own words, will say, what he desires of us Africans are persons who are conscious. When we say conscious, in his own words, what did he say? He says that by one who is conscious, we do not need to equivocate it with degrees. So a conscious man or woman, in Kwame Ture's own words, is one that recognizes or who recognizes their responsibility to humanity and fulfills it. It is in this light that I pay homage to the organizers of this program, because they have actually recognized their responsibility to humanity, and not just humanity, Black Africans and people of African descent, who are always exploited, chastised, and looked as the lesser order. And so, first and foremost, I will want to also state that in the Institute of African Studies, as in other Black intellectual communities, we have Pan-Africanism from the base. And when we say Pan-Africanism from the base, it is to be understood that everybody matters. It does not matter your level of education. It does not matter where you come from. So long as you believe in Africa and you are ready to sacrifice for Africa, you join the trade. So within African studies, we are often encouraged more and more often to, and University of Ghana at large, to examine our own Black scholars, what they said, what they wrote, so that we know ourselves more and more. First and foremost, I will want to zoom into my discussion by talking about Black African unification. And you will all agree that at this critical moment, we are all unified for a common purpose of identifying who our enemies are and how to strengthen our base so that we can resist forms of oppression wherever they manifest. So in 3200 BC, Pharaoh Mane unified Lower and Upper Kemet. There is a certain sense of which he struggled for that unification. That Black Africans and people of African descent, wherever they are, when they are unified, when they come together for a common purpose of, fighting their oppressors, the oppressors, one, become very scared, and sometimes they begin to call us names. And it is important to recognize also that as early as 1997, 1998, Mzee Nelson Mandela was on American CIA list as a terrorist. Why was he a terrorist? He was a terrorist because he had the sense of unity, the sense of purpose to resist forms of exploitation of occupied South Africa then. Now, it is it will not be too important for us to look at some of the unpalatable happenings on the continent. But it will also not be fair to deodorize some of the happenings to say that they did not actually happen or they are not happening. In Africa, Cloraki had earlier on warned, and he stated clearly that even after independence, there were serious technocrats and other persons from the base who still had strong loyal ties to ethnicity and borders, that they will overlook certain struggles that are aimed at unifying Black Africans wherever they may belong. And some of these ethnic struggles also feed into religious affiliation, which some of them continue to give the continent a bad name. And CNN, Voice of America, or sometimes American media largely, and we say it, neo-colonial media, will not hesitate to point to those elements, that there is Al-Shabaab, there is Boko Haram, and there are other let me say, defined groups such as the Janjaweed. But those are just pockets of violence. And like my other co-presenters have mentioned, Africa is rising. Africa is becoming stronger and stronger. But that is not to say that today, as it exists, Africa is not seen as a trophy. From wherever you see it, from the Chinese, from the Americans, and from other parts of Europe, Africa is seen as a trophy to be won, to be coveted, to be competed for. So we will see in Africa and in Ghana and other parts of the world, Chinese, American business conglomerates and few collaborators. And I use collaborators because most of our Pan-African fathers use that word a lot, because we have indigenous persons fronting for them, and they will not hesitate to say that a Black African in the diaspora should not be given a certain space for development than to give it to the persons who are known to have exploited us in most grave and unimagined extensions. So now, why are we at this critical moment so curious to know some of our weaknesses? It is important because when we know some of our weaknesses, it positions us for us to anchor ourselves, to unify ourselves, to have that level of arsenal that can make us resist forms of oppression in their insidious ways that they come. I want to share a certain statement here, and you realize that Obama had remarked that the future of Libyans, after they had done serious destruction on the continent or the country of Libya, which has 140 tribes, that Libyans will now come together to, consolidate Libya. And earlier, you realize that most of the engagements, as I earlier on mentioned, was to create havoc, and the purpose of creating that havoc is to have that continual control and influence. And I was very much pleased when Professor Baba Small talked about the loans and from IMF and the World Bank, which are all controlled by these imperial agencies and exploiters. So in Hugo Chavez's speech, that was on the 26th of September 2011, in his attempt to draw the worrying incidents of American interference in the affairs of other sovereign states, he addressed the United Nations General Assembly in Caracas, saying, and this is a profound statement, a congressman from Cleveland, Ohio, Dennis Kucinich, that was 1990, and he was congressman 1997 to 2000. And in his presentation, and I'm making this, bringing this in for us to understand that Africa is seen as a trophy to be competed for and to be recolonized so long as there is something that is still left in the bowels of the earth to be extracted. That America needed $500 million US to destroy Libya and 100 million less to rebuild the Horn of Africa, and the Horn of Africa comes in very strongly. Not that they don't have resources, both human capacity, but human and natural resources. Somalia, Kenya, Djibouti, Ethiopia, they have most of these resources that they can, survive either as trade partners, either as intellectuals or agrarian reforms and all that. But you see, these imperial agencies, in order to keep us down, will continue to foment trouble. And in that fomentation of trouble, they now will indebt us. So at the end of the day, it is no longer their duty to help us build, it is to destroy us, and at the end of the day, come insidiously and offer loans, and the circle of poverty and enslavement continue to exist. So wisen up, knowing who our enemy is, and the many forms that the enemy manifests themselves, enable us to properly galvanize ourselves, our resources, our spirituality, and human intellectual base, whether it is in Trinidad and Tobago, it is in Guyana, whether it is in the US or anywhere in the world. Because I hold the view, wherever a black man's freedom is threatened in any part of the world, it affects me directly or indirectly. So in this regard, there is need for us to look within ourselves. What gives rise for this festering of Africa being a trophy? We cannot deny what Klorake earlier on observed. And he says strong ethnic loyalties. We go to Sudan, you realize that some of the challenges that we have are ethnic conflicts. We go to Nigeria, we have Packers. Now it is better and quite successful, but those were some of the things. And Kwame Ture, in his own statement, his own words, he said that what the imperial forces, and he mentioned America, but I want to just make that universal statement of the imperial forces. It could be America or anywhere, it could be black collaborators. What they do, they no longer do direct confrontation, they use the weapon of pitching one person against the other. They can play the religious card, they can play the ethnic card, they can play the clan, card. And we have packets of that as smoldering press that have the propensity of lighting up some fragile democracies, not every part of Africa. So now, what are the successes? And most of the successes have been given by my good sister now, and the intervention or support of African Union Commission economic forces in most regions in West Africa has been very, very, very helpful in most cases. And so that calls to mind what Kwame Nkrumah earlier on mentioned of having an African standard army. We say there is already an African standard army and there is a collective voice of purpose. But then at certain moments, we fail to accurately diagnose the problem or the challenges of Africa in speaking as a collective voice. How many of us will agree that Libya today is worse off than it was during the tenure of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi? Yet, it appears then that most of Africa's forces, OAU and other forces, did not have that much control and say when there was that needless collateral damage and destruction in the face of Libya. Other experts have now blamed the spillover of packets of violence. I don't want to use Islamic extremists because violence has no color. In some parts of the Sahelian region and parts of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Ghana quite recently have had some discussions with regards to policing the borders as there are escalating tensions of terrorist attacks. And experts say that these are coming from the destructive hand. And when I say the destructive hand, we have to call things by their names. America and their allied forces, NATO, which saw that the flourishing Libya should not stand. Now, it is important to state that what is heartwarming is not in entirely the successes, but the spirit of those who are fighting for us. And when I say the spirit of those who are fighting for us, Kwame Ture received a lot of trust, and Mosiah Gabi received a lot of trust. Kwame Nkrumah was betrayed, and Kwame Ture, in his own words and others, stated that Nkrumah was did not die of cancer, but the cancer of betrayal. But currently, what I see is as positive is what is happening in the Horn of Africa Cooperation when Isaias Afwerki together with Mohamed Abiy, and I will not forget of Somalia, Mohamed, who are all teaming up to solve their differences. And the reason why I am so much happy about that effort of solving their differences is because most of their differences are created by colonial machinations, where persons have come to draw borders and tell us that here is where we belong. This was our territory and that was our territory, and we have to reclaim it. And mostly the reclamation is not done through dialogue. It is not done through consultation, but Western forces, again, pitching African brother against African brother. That is how they sell their arms. That is how they make their money. And that is how they profit. So long as Africa remains in debt, they flourish. So at this critical moment, the concept of Pan-Africanism from the base, I will use the Institute of African Studies, for example. There is currently a page that is run, is called Africa Decolonials. And Africa Decolonials largely examine African literature written by Africans for Africans. And that we cannot talk about Africans when we don't know who we are. And again, I will reference Professor Small when he talks about African spirituality, going back to classical Kemet, who were our fathers, how did they live, how did they resist of oppression. We look at most of the achievements of the pharaohs, how did they do it? But then we are not even sometimes going too far. We look at the writings of Sheikh Anta Diop. We look at persons like Pauline Vieira, who went into filmmaking, and other persons, Osman Sambene, who through media were able to portray Africa in ways that give us our true picture and our true representation. And in that page, we are not just talking about reading books about Black scholars in Harvard or University of Ghana. We are also looking at practical solutions. And when we say practical solutions, both Professor Small and my sister spoke about the youth. And it is true, if we don't channel the energy of the youth, Kwame Ture in his own words and other African fighters, freedom fighters, will say that they will be channeled into negative energies. And what are these negative energies? They are the unpalatable things that I have mentioned, most of which are very few, but Western media, so gullible as they are, who want to continuously see us as a lesser other, will show those portions. So if we have this youth, what plans are we going to do in order to advance them in terms of not just the intellectual base, but other areas? One, we will look at examples from Cuba where there were agrarian reforms that somehow cushioned the economy of Cuba. In Africa, and when Gaddafi came with his entourage and passed through en route to Mali, Burkina, and other places, he mentioned that one of the resources that we have and that which is underutilized is the vast acreage of land, and there is need to have that agrarian reforms. And we cannot talk about importation of rice from China, from Taiwan, Malaysia, and other persons when we ignore that in our backyard we are not giving agriculture the necessary boost. And there is one important reason why I am so much emphasizing on agriculture. And the reason why I want to talk so much on this aspect of agriculture, Thomas Sankara in his own way says that anytime you eat, look into your place. That is imperialism. So imperialism is not just that straight-jacketed way that I am being exploited. So there is need for that consciousness that Kwame Ture spoke about, that if you are even wearing a certain type of clothes, you are eating a certain type of food, you are having a certain kind of education, And at the end of the day, that education makes you teach somewhere other than your people who should be the primary beneficiaries of those knowledge. Exploitation and imperialism is ongoing and is grand scale. So in agriculture, what are some of the crops that will serve our purpose as indigenous Africans? How can they be patronized? How can they be marketed? How can they serve our nutrition and spiritual purposes? So I am very, very much happy that Professor Small in his own words admitted that he had gone to most parts of the country, including that of northern Ghana. Northern Ghana, where I come from, there is so much vast grassland that can allow for cattle grazing as we have in the Maasai in Kenya. There is so much land that can encourage agriculture. But quite recently, and when I say quite recently, for close to 2 decades, government have only made token gestures to, agriculture. And when I say token gestures, there is, even if there are national policies promoting agriculture, they only exist on paper and not made manifest as the kind of grand scale that we want. So at this critical moment, I will mention agriculture, I will mention security, I will mention exploitation, but then I also crown it with the serious and modest efforts that have been made by Black Africans and people of African descent to recognize that there is a home, there is a place. And most persons, including Professor Small, have come back. Not only, it is not so much important to say that he's come to stay in Ghana. He's come to stay in Ghana to establish business, but not only business, he's come to Ghana to give us a motivation, to give us encouragement, to give us support, so that we will continue to realize ourselves, our identity, who we are. Now, the clan politics is gradually fading away. But what is currently happening is most governments in Africa will continue, in certain instances, use populist schemes, which are not which are very ephemeral in nature. If we want to industrialize, there must be a clear map. And Kwame Nkrumah used to, or had that 50-year development plan for Africans or for Ghanaians. Because most of the things that Kwame Nkrumah said, he did not do them, limiting them to only Ghana, but he had African in mind. A reason why he was made co-president of Guinea. So we cannot offer very ephemeral solutions to the challenges of Africa. So when we talk about education, what kind of education do we desire? What kind of challenges do we envision we will face in the next 50 or 100 years? And what plans or institutional apparatus do we put in place now so that we can be able to curb some of those challenges? So it is important that even as Africans, we continue to inculcate in ourselves the spirit of self-awareness, beginning from classical Kemet, looking at Farouk Manet, and I mentioned the unification of Lower Kemet 3000 to 3200 BC. We look at the efforts of our ancestor, Reverend Abenete. We look at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We have Small. And what Kwame Ture did that I found very profound is his touch of base. And forgive me, Professor Small, if I have not seen you in most of our campuses in Ghana. But most of our youth are aligned with most populist politicians, and most of them are misled and they don't fully understand the African notion of consciousness. What is it? Which forms does it manifest? When you see an African consciousness, what set does it wear? What food does he eat? What clothes? What spirituality does it profess? So there is need for us to touch base. And when I say touch base, visit our primary schools, visit our junior high schools, visit our universities, and Kwame Ture did a lot of that. And that was one of the reasons that ignited the passion of Africans and Black Africans and people of African descent to move in a certain direction, to act in a certain direction, to behave in a certain direction. And I feel that at this critical moment, we should begin to re-actualize those foundations. It will anchor us so that we firmly and strongly position ourselves in ways that can make us resist imperialism and new colonialism as it continues to manifest in our daily lives. So I will end here. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Forgive me. I think we've had a very rich discussion. We thank you, Joseph. It was a very good outlay of some of the issues. One of the things I think our three panelists had in common is their concern for what would happen to young people. It was expressed both in terms of the positives and in terms of the challenges. And I think that's an area that we might want to explore a little more. We also understood and heard from our panelists the challenges of the neocolonial environment in which Africa continues to find itself. But we heard of the successes of the way in which Africa is managing some of the broader issues, such as peace and conflict in areas not just on the continent, which has certainly been critical with ECOWAS and then more recently with Obasanjo-led teams. But then we saw South Africa sort of engaging between Ukraine and Russia on the international stage. So there is a very interesting issues raised and of concern. Now we're going to open the floor, and I hope we still have everyone with us. Yes, there's Professor Small, right. We're going to open the floor to take some questions and comments, and we're allowing people who are watching us either on Facebook or LinkedIn on YouTube to submit their questions, and we'll look at some of those questions as well. One of the issues I'd like to ask our panelists, and probably start with Professor Small, is this issue. We talked about young people, and what I think people are seeing, and that's important to be able to address what people are seeing. People are seeing young African men leaving their homeland and losing their lives in that horrific Mediterranean Middle Passage, trying to reach to Europe for some better way of life that they think they may be able to find there. And I think it would be our listeners and so would be interested to understand. If we could disaggregate that problem, separate that problem a little more for them. What's the causes? What do we see? How do we define the problem? And how can it be addressed? So, Professor Small, that's the hard one, but I'm starting with you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can
You
hear
me. Yeah, you see, I had to change location, but I'm good.
I do. I recognize it.
Yeah, that's an important question because we are losing so many lives. And this, you can't separate poverty from employment or unemployment. And you can't separate poverty and unemployment from education. And you can't separate poverty, unemployment, and education from industrialization. Indigenous industrialization. There must be a revolutionary trend towards that. And that gets fortified, believe it or not, by culture. You know, people sell their culture to themselves and to the rest of the world. And culture informs how we create things that we use. And so we need to bind them together. The economic, the politics, the culture, and the sacred science must be in discussion together on all occasions. And I think we have the opportunity to create the employment possibilities for our young people, but there must be a demand by our government in terms of how contracts are written as regards to the removal of raw materials from our land. If you're taking oil out of the western region near Takoradi, fine, we want to sell our oil, but we want the refining plant built in Takoradi so the youth of that region can have work. Not only work, but learn the technology of the industry so that they can expand the possibilities of what that technology will create for the society. Plastic, for instance, which is used to make darn near everything we use in the world today, comes from petroleum. And we are producing all of this petroleum, but we don't have a single factory that's making the plastic. You know what I'm saying? And we could do it for almost any industry, even the gold industry. We're sending the raw product away instead of carrying on the refinery skills and the chemistry and other technical and scientific skills necessary to bring gold to a finished product and sell it to the rest of the world. Now, Magufuli did a good job, and we need to study what he did in Tanzania as regard vis-a-vis the British and those companies. He was very successful.
Yes.
And the same thing when we look at what Mugabe was able to do with the gold diamond industry before, he was had to leave us and go back home. And
Yes.
so
And I think
how do we
Professor
build up
Small.
the
Yeah.
technology?
Mhm.
Build up the technology, build up the industry, build up local industries that's already there, the incubators that are there, pull those incubators together and begin to create a homegrown industry.
Right. I hear you. So what I'm hearing from Professor Small is that we have to try to use the resources we have, allow the society to be able to engage with those resources so that we create jobs for them and that young people will be able to stay home and work. Brother Aketema, do you want to say anything about the problems that need to be addressed that would, and how we could address to keep those young people home and not on those perilous boats where they're losing their lives? We can't hear you. Maybe you'll have to unmute yourself. No, you've muted yourself again. Right. Good. Now we can hear.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I want to pay historical homage to Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and to mention that as early as 1961-63, in Ghana, there were a lot of industries in most deprived areas in the whole of the country. In Bolgatanga, there was the meat factory, and he and President Maurice Yemyogo of Upper Volta, there was a certain sense of Pan-Africanism, that northern cattle will come there, and there was some level of revenue. If he stayed long, that expansion would have been done. And that is to even say that around that same period, radios were assembled in Ghana, televisions were assembled in Ghana, and other parts of, vehicles. So Nana Amos Wilson says that if you want to know the cause of a problem, look at the one who benefits from it. Who are the beneficiaries of all these cheap labor from Black Africans and people of African descent? The people who keep it down are the people who orchestrate some of our challenges back home. I would not want to say that it is not totally the case that we should not blame people. We should blame people. But then come home to ourselves and say that there must be sustainable national dialogue with regards to policies and projects that are aimed towards developing the African economy. If you have a Kenyatta-led administration having a certain sense of development, and then when he leaves, and then a Ruto kind of development, those are not sustainable. In Ghana, if we have Akufo-Addo forms of development plans, which are not largely agreed by other nationalists or other opposition leaders, and then when they leave, another person comes, he begins to introduce, bring home new friends. So there is need for conscious development programs and projects that can faithfully be sustained. At the beginning stages, it will not solve so much of the challenges because development is in stages. It cannot instantaneously curb the challenge. But for a period of time, the economy will pick up, industrialization will pick up, and then our youth will be much more comforted.
Okay, Angela, are you back with us? I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to the question as well, which is how could we address the problem that we find of young people, mainly young men, finding themselves on these boats, trying to leave their country of origin, and losing their lives in this new and horrific little passage to Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. To add to all what they've said, they've all been, I agree with the various comments, got to do with industrialization, got to do with education, so on and so forth. Just to add to it, I would say that, or strategic communication, or sensitization of the youth, prospective youth, because we notice that those are the kind of people who actually go through those perilous journeys. It's important that you hardly see someone, or we have hardly actually gotten people who are from the university set up, or graduate from the university using those. Majority of them are either from these technical vocational training entities, and actually, in Ghana, for example, we have the GIZ working on the program Migration for Development alongside the German Development Corporation, the GIZ, alongside the Labor Department. You would realize that they target most of these institutions, and then they ensure that they pass on knowledge, because most of them are very should I say, pardon me to use the word, gullible towards issues of traffickers and smugglers. So these are some of the things that are being used as initiatives by a lot of African governments to curtail these incidents. Another thing that is being used as for this kind of to stop this kind of incidents is the ambassadors, those who have gone through those journeys and are still alive to tell their stories. Those are also used. Another thing that could be done at the governmental level is to be very strategic about labor exploitation, because you would realize that a country like Ghana, for example, is discussing issues of brain drain as nurses are concerned. But we know that on the ground, we have a lot of qualified nurses from the institutions, various institutions, who are jobless. So how then do we decide that there is the need for us to make sure that those countries that lack, or there's a dearth of these health professionals, we are able to trade with them, so just like we have typical examples like Philippines, that would be able to benefit rather than keeping them at home and not benefiting, getting the brain waste I spoke about earlier, and then not getting revenue as a nation state. So these are some of the things that we could use. At the continental level, we have the Joint Labor Migration Program going on between the African Union, the International Labor Organization, the International Organization for Migration, as well as the UN Economic Commission for Africa. These have come together to form a program, and what we are doing is seeing how best we can scale migrants, see how best we can protect migrants and their interests, see how best we can actually navigate issues of humanitarian migrants or migrants affected by humanitarian crisis, so on and so forth. And then see how best actually to guide member states and regional economic communities on the continent to ensure that there is bilateral labor agreement. And then we have even produced a guide that they could use, so that they factor in all the essentials before dealing with most of these states, not only talking about the West, but recently about the Gulf Cooperation countries, so on and so forth. So these are some of the things, that avenues that I would add to it that we use.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move quickly because there are many questions that people, of course, the conversation has generated a lot of interest. One of the questions I have before me is, what do you think might be the best strategy for unifying the diaspora, the African diaspora globally? Is there any way in which we can get, I know, Angela, you raised a lot of ideas. Professor Small was sharing some with us as well, ways in which the African diaspora can be greater unified for the benefit of African development. Professor Small, do
Okay,
you
thank
want
you
to
very
finish
much.
with that?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Well,
Maybe I'll ask.
no, Sister Angela, go. You may
Okay,
go,
go
my
ahead,
sister.
Angela. Professor Small has given the floor over to you first.
Thank you, Professor Small. I would say that there's the need for us to first carry out a mapping. So, what we looked at were very that are noted to have a lot of Black populace or African populace diasporas. So we started with that engagement process. But then again, when you look at you always engage, it's a multi-stakeholder initiative. We always engage with the various countries or the host governments, statistics departments, universities, so on and so forth, depending on the kind of people we're looking for. A typical example is this. When we enter China, we are looking at universities because of African students studying in China. So we go straight up to these universities. If it was the past Ukraine, we would universities again because we know there are a lot of African students training to become medical professionals. So we do that. Then when we come to countries like probably the United States, Canada, and all, we look at professionals. We zero in on professionals. We don't just single them out, but the main concentration is on professionals and how best to navigate, engage them towards the development that we are looking for. So we look and then we see interest areas. Then again, we actually try and urge diasporas to form not only their organizations, because we've noticed that there are a lot of African diaspora organizations, but they are all working in silos. What about coming together? Because there's power in the formation of networks for us to be able to actually zero in, because you have more clout, you have more voice, and it will be heard when you speak. So it's easier for us to leverage that value of networks and then be able to actually pass on the kind of message and then receive the kind of message, that concrete message that the diaspora has, so that we are able to channel it into our programs and policies. Thank you.
Okay. Professor Small, would you like to comment on that question?
Well, Angela covered a lot, but there is a couple of spaces that rarely gets covered. One, the concept six region need to be made actual and real by the African Union. Two, there must be a better and more unique pathway to dual citizenship for those of us in the diaspora who are the refugees of slavery. Because if you don't reckon with that problem, you got what? Almost a half a billion people between Colombia, Brazil, the United States, and the Caribbean who are refugees. And we don't even speak about them. We're talking about them like we are European migrants to America. No, we were prisoners of war and refugees, and we should not have to come home in the same way a European American or European, Western European person would have to come into Africa. That's wrong. We have not raised this in any legal international forums, and I've always discouraged that. But I think it needs to be raised at the level of the African Union, um, because you're talking about a lot of trained and wealthy people. The African American population spent last year $1.7 trillion, okay, mostly with non African peoples, because the relationship that should be there is not there. We're looking to spend over $2 trillion in consumer dollars this year. You know, $2 trillion. Again, it will be with the Asian community, the Arab community, the white community, and the white Latino community. And I make a separation between African Latinos and European Latinos. And so the relationship between that population in the Caribbean, in Central South America, and North America, those who were prisoners of war, and we are still, according to UN protocol, since in the transatlantic slave trade was considered to be a crime against humanity, then treat us like that's who we are. And you will find that population will move their technology and their wealth more rapidly towards the continent. And so I think those two areas need to be looked at, and the sixth region as a concept and if Sister Angie want to explain that further, because a lot of people may not know what it is, but it's a concept for those who didn't live on the continent to be a part of the African Union process. And I know it's still in process, but it is a process that needs to be developed even more rapidly to bring this population and the wealth of this population and the educational technocrats in this population closer in relationship to Africa. We know that 99% of people may not move home. I will move given the chance, but most won't. But the interaction is what we want, both economically, politically, and culturally.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to throw this question at Joseph Akitima. Joseph, there's a question about the restitution of African works of art from the European continent and from North America that belong to Africa, belong to different African nations, different African peoples across the continent. And work is being done, we understand, to have that work returned. Is it fast enough? Are we making enough noise about it? What's happening? What's your take on that, Akitima? You have to unmute yourself. Right. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. You're unmuted now. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the discussion on African art has rightly and correctly gained the right momentum. And this way, we can talk about the Oba Palace Raid 1886, 87, if I'm right, and other areas. And they saw this largely as primitive art, only to display them as trophies and make gains out of them. What I am currently a bit troubled or worried about, I don't know even if I should be worried or troubled, is the generational gap, the essence with which they were held, protected, and the spiritual and economic, attachments that our forefathers and ancestors had with them. Would we as Africans or Black Africans receiving them to our respective communities accord the same level of spirituality and reverence to them? Remember, these were people who didn't even share in our religion, they didn't share in our rights, they didn't share in the value of these things. So the head of Oba is the head of Oba. So one, we should begin to rethink and galvanize ourselves as indigenous Africans, ready to receive them and use the proper names. They were stolen, they were looted, and we should not be, we should unapologetically say things the way they are. We should give things by their proper names. But receiving them from home, there is that spiritual dimension, the educational dimension, so that those of us receiving them should handle them in such a way that they do not end up where they are coming from. That for me is, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I'm going to ask Angela. Angela, do you think that preparation of our population that Joseph is speaking of, can you tell us if that's happening anywhere? How is that being treated?
Thank you very much. Actually, this has come up a few times. It started sometime 2 years ago, alongside a lot of dialogue in conjunction with the UNFPA on some of these returning of artifacts and all, being led especially by this diaspora network in the UK, African Foundation for Development, and they have written a few things in that respect, making sure, advocating for Britain to let go of most of these things because most of our museums are empty. Actually, the AU was part of this. However, when it comes to issues of monuments, we then shift it to the Social Affairs Department because they have culture. They deal with issues of culture and monuments. So yes, I took part in the dialogue, but then every other thing was handed over to the Social Affairs Department. Now, in view of that, there's something else in the pipeline because we've received, should I say, proposals for a Marcus Garvey bronze statue project. If there are a few other things in the pipeline as well, that CEDO actually receives the diaspora, engages them, and then you passes them on to the next department or the relevant department. All these phases are going to feed into Ghana's resolution or decision, AU decision on reparations, because as part of the dictates of that decision, there is a segment that speaks to most of these works of art, artifacts, and so on and so forth, and then return even of the lost souls, some of the lost souls who are being actually showcased in most of these places. So it's one of those things that there's going to be currently a continental momentum very soon, because I'm part of the initial working group. It just, like I said, it just happened in February, and now that it's out, that's something that we are currently working on in all the phases. So we are going to be bringing on board not only the AU, but we're going to bring on board all relevant partners from CARICOM, FIPAN, wherever, making sure that we have a multifaceted and all-inclusive kind of conversation or initiative for us to be successful in this respect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, time is running out on us, and I'd really like to give each panelist an opportunity to give us your closing remarks. So, Joseph, I'm going to start with you. Would you like to share some closing remarks with us? You've got about 1 minute. Oops, you're muted, Joseph. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
First and foremost, wonderful discussion from both of us. I mean, the two of us. But I am a supporter of Pan-Africanism from the base. And mostly in our pages, African Decolonial page, I tell a lot of people, including my most estimable professors, that whatever we discuss and publish as knowledge regarding African successes and challenges, if it does not permeate to the very fabric of the popular masses, and in our case, the youth and those in urban areas, the farmers, the cattle raiders, and all those persons who are the backbone of the economy, our fight may not be too effective in realizing the cause. So there is need, wherever we see ourselves in our offices, in our organization, there is need for those of us who are on the Ivory Tower, the top of the Iroko, to come to the base to explain some of these concepts of exploitation and new forms of imperialism, which will allow them to inculcate in their lives the self-consciousness that Kwame Ture stood for and died for.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, brother. Angela, back to you. Do you have a 1 minute closing statement?
Okay. Thank you very much. I would say it's been a pleasant evening or morning with you. Yes, with regards to issues of the citizen, there have been a lot of initiatives that I cannot use particular platform to actually propagate, but we are seeing to it, like I mentioned, most African entities work in silos. We're trying as much as possible to gain that kind of making sure that African diaspora are able to actually identify with the various umbrella bodies or various diasporas that should represent them at the African Union. This has started throughout the Diaspora Focal Points workshop all the way in 2016, and we are still on that. We currently have a draft political and legal framework for the inclusion of the diaspora in the African Union processes and structures as well. In all, I would say that it would be very good if we would all embrace the kind of diversity we have as Africans, because in that lies our strength. The outside world is already fighting us, and it's only up to us to decide that we really want to integrate. It shouldn't be a political statement, but we should see each other as brothers and sisters or formidable levers that will be able to actually stand and then make sure that we get the kind of Africa we want and we get the kind of recognition for our race. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela. And of course, I left the last word for our good Professor James Small.
Well, it's been an honor. both Joseph and Angela, and of course, Dr. Asha, being in your presence. Um, it all comes down to Joseph touched on it. How do we reach the masses? The masses of our people are not in the ivory tower. The masses of our people are not in the corporate structure. How do we reach them? Social media has given us the technology to do this work in a way that we've never been able to. In the average month, I reach over 1 million people in any given month with some of my lectures. And I try to reach that person at the grassroots level with my discussions. And so the other thing that we need to focus on is to get rid of the colonial curricula in our school system. Wipe it out. That's not something that should be a process. We could do that overnight and put in place an African curricula that tells our story and not tells the enemy's perception of our story to us, so that we can begin to create the African personality. There needs to be a world African personality. Culture is not just dancing and music or movies. Those are tools of culture. Culture is the idea of your humanity and your concept of cosmology and ecology, your world view. The tools help you explain that to yourself and the world. So putting African culture at the front of the agenda, changing the colonial curricula and creating an African curricula that reflects indigeneity and ancestry. And we will create a revolution in rebirthing the African consciousness and rebirthing the African mind.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Small. Thank you, Angela. It was a pleasure having you. Thank you, Joseph Aketimov. It was a pleasure having you. And I'm sure our listeners just absolutely loved this evening's discussion. We look forward to all of them joining us next week, Thursday, same time, 5 o'clock, same place. We thank you all for joining us, okay? And I think now our time is up. But again, to our listeners, thank you all very much for joining us for the last 2 hours on this Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series 2023. And we look forward to seeing you next Thursday. Akwaba, as they say, huh?